Chapter 5. Greg Adams, in the shower, looked a great deal better than she sang. Nevertheless, she was happy. For her, which is to say tonight she had a general absence of depression. And so she sang and splashed, hurriedly, so that she could wash all the soap off before the day's supply of hot water disappeared. A tune was going through her head, some old thing from her mother's flapper days. Life is just a bowl of cherries. Life is just a bowl of weevils, she sang to that tune. Da-dee-da-da-da. Life is just a bowl of weevils, da-dee-da-dum. She had managed to get 12 lines in a morning soap opera for next week, with promise of more in the future. As usual, she was playing a teenager, baby-voiced and excruciatingly sweet. That slight Western accent she hadn't been able to get rid of didn't hurt either. She had noticed that all the nauseatingly sweet little children who did commercials, "Gee, Mom, this tastes like more," seemed to have a Western accent. Perhaps some executive power thought it made them sound more childlike. She was going to a party tonight with Tony, who was in her acting class and was one of her semi-platonic friends. They lent each other money and took each other to parties where free food and liquor could be had for a minimum of charm. He was younger than she and had long hair that fell into his eyes when he shook his head, and he mumbled when he spoke. If you asked him a question, he would wriggle and scratch himself and look at the floor as if he were feeling out the line. And finally, he would grunt some extraordinarily emotional result like, "Yeah, let's go to the movies." She knew it was an act, that when he was very excited or overwrought, he lapsed into the most beautifully modulated Shakespearean diction she had ever heard. All the boys in her acting class were like that, the ones who took her out and the ones who were married and even poorer, and the fairies. She was bored with them all. In her messy, overcrowded closet, she found a red dress she had liked and had forgotten she owned. It was a meeting people dress for parties. A blonde girl in a red dress always seemed to be able to manage without introductions. It wasn't as if she hoped to meet anyone non-boring at this party. Actually, she was only going there because there would be food and good scotch, and it would be a way not to be alone. When she was alone in her apartment, she could feel the stifling sensation she had learned to fear creep up on her. 1 minute, things were all right, and then all of a sudden, a 10-pound weight would establish itself on her chest, and she would hardly be able to breathe, let alone swallow. Jazz music on the phonograph and cheap vermouth helped a little. Telephone conversations with her friends by the hour helped even more, but all of these were merely sedatives to dull the panic and lift the weight. They could not remove it. Around the circle of light by her bed, there were shadows waiting to envelop her as soon as she put down the telephone receiver and broke away from the reassuring voice at the other end. Sometimes her cat would slip up to her and rub his furry head against her ankle, and, looking down at him, she would feel an immense, overwhelming affection for him. My little cat. Pencil-line ribs to move with breathing as he slept. Signs of life to remind her that there were other worlds inside of other people's skulls, even inside a cat's little skull. It made her feel less alone, less stifled, less afraid of something she could not really name. You could die in New York behind the locked door of your apartment, and no one would ever know until some neighbor complained of the smell. Yes, your friends would say then. I remember I hadn't heard from her for some time, but I thought she was just sulking. Or I thought she had a new job and was busy. Busy? Greg thought, busy being unemployed. Tony was an hour late, which was like him. When he finally arrived, she was so lonely she was even glad to see him. "Hey," he said, "I remember that dress." He leaned down and kissed her on the cheek. She remembered then with embarrassment that she had worn the dress on the evening of the first and only night she had gone to bed with him. No doubt he thought of the dress with sentiment. No wonder she had forced it to the far end of her untidy closet. It was a night and a dress she wanted to forget. there were some lovers you could have once, and only once, and then you never wanted to have them again. Not that they weren't skillful and considerate, because they usually were, but they had held each other out of loneliness and fear and curiosity and lust and hope that this time they would find something beautiful. And in the morning, they would find sheets that looked like a geographical terrain, and perhaps an overturned ashtray on the rug beside the bed, and no trace whatever of the face of love. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "They'll eat everything before we even get there." The party was at the apartment of a middle-aged actress whom Tony knew. The room was dark and already filled with smoke and people, as if they were leftover observers from a fire. Greg coughed and moved with the clockwise motion of the crowd to the window end of the room, hoping she would find the bar there. With an icy glass in her hand, she felt better. Tony put a lighted cigarette into her other hand. Now she had the props, and the play could begin. A play called Isn't This Fun? "See those 3 men over there?" he whispered. "See the tall young one? You know who he is?" Tony must have been excited. He had said 3 complete sentences, one right after the other. "Who?" "David Wilder Savage." David Wilder Savage had been one of the first people she had heard of when she had come to New York. It was an eccentric name, and he suited it. Most people thought it was a pseudonym, taken so that he would be remembered. For whatever reason, it had worked. Nobody ever referred to him as Savage. They went through the whole routine. He had been one of the boy wonders of Broadway, producing his first play at 25, a hit which had run for nearly 2 years. Every play he produced after that was a success, until the one he had done at the beginning of this season, which had closed in 4 weeks. The magic name, David Wilder Savage, had been the only thing to hold it on Broadway that long. The play itself had little theatrical excitement. Thoughtful, fragile, and of limited appeal, it had been written by a man who was one of the few people David Wilder Savage had ever been close to. Like many men who cut a heartless swath through the worlds of business and of bedrooms, David Wilder Savage had one friend whom he cared for deeply and whom he protected. They had been roommates in college, the author and the producer, and in the 14 years since their graduation, the author had been working on this one play while holding various jobs to make a living. That fact alone would have warned away nearly any would-be producer. It would have warned away David Wilder Savage before anyone else, because if anyone had an instinct for success and failure, it was he. But this closest friend had been killed in an automobile crash in the spring, and in the fall, David Wilder Savage, against the advice of anyone who dared to give it to him, put the play on Broadway. It was not because he was confused by his bereavement. He knew exactly what he was doing. It was one of the rare gestures of sentimentality, and even more, of love, from a man who was known for his ruthlessness. It was ironic that his one act from the heart should turn out to be a debacle, but not unusual, since David Wilder Savage himself would be the first to say that if a con man ever tried to save a child from drowning in a moment of pure goodness, he would be sure to be eaten by a shark. "Do you know him?" Greg whispered back. "I read for him once. He probably doesn't remember me." "Do I dare go over and talk to him?" "Why not?" "It's a party," Tony said without much enthusiasm. "Come with me." He kissed her lightly on the temple, his cheek bulging out with an hors d'oeuvre he had just gobbled. "What for? Pretty girls have much better luck alone." She was relieved that he didn't want to accompany her, but when she had worked her way through the crowd to where David Wilder Savage now stood by himself, she was taken with panic. What could she say to him? "Hello, I'm an actress." She might as well hold her hand out and ask for a dime for a cup of coffee. It would be greeted by the same enthusiasm. What an attractive man he was. Satanic, that was the word for him. 35 years old and on top of the world. with that knowing, civilized face looking down at all the ambitious people like herself who were sidling up trying to think of clever things to say to him. She looked down at her glass, wishing she could find a place to get rid of it. "Who the hell are you?" he said pleasantly. She looked up at him, surprised. "Greg Adams." "I'm David Wilder Savage, and as they always say at cocktail parties, what do you do?" "I'm a dental assistant." He smiled. "That's a surprise. You look like a parolee from boarding school." "I was once, and very sophisticated too, black lipstick and all." "Have you read a book called Many Faces?" She had heard of it. The author was a Portuguese. "I read the reviews." "That's not much help." "You'd be surprised," she said, "how well I can discuss a book from the reviews." "And a movie from the cast listing on the marquee?" "That's right." There was an American couple talking French at her elbow. She nodded toward them. "And with people like that, I can say I really understand your French perfectly, but I can't speak it back to you because my accent is unintelligible." "I'm sorry you haven't read Many Faces," he said. "I would have liked to know if it did something to you too, and what. I'm a producer, and I think there may be a good play in it." He had a way about him, something in the intimate lowering of his voice that made her feel as if she and her opinions were very important to him. Actually, why should he care what she, a working girl he'd met at a party, thought of a book? Because he thought she was the average public, of course, a girl who came to Manhattan every day on the subway from Queens with her tuna fish sandwich in a brown paper bag, who lived with her parents and washed her hair every Thursday night and went to the movies with her boyfriend every Saturday night. And yet, he had that way about him. "I'll read it tomorrow," she said. "It'll be too late to tell you what I think, but now I want to read it anyway." "You'll love it." Anyone else, she was thinking, could say, "You'll love it," and it would be small talk, a mere figure of speech. With David Wilder Savage, the sentence was like handing someone a gift. It was as if he wanted to give her the bit of pleasure of discovering a new idea, a magical story. Charm, she thought. Charm was just a word before, but now I know what it is. It's anything this man says. He touched her arm. "See that couple over there? They've come to the wrong party. There's another one in the apartment downstairs, and that's where they were supposed to go. Now he wants to leave, and she says she's having a good time and wants to stay. They're having a fight. They were a young couple, a pouting, bosomy girl in a white dress and a weak-looking man. Look at the gestures and angry faces," Greg said, laughing. "They look like a TV set with the sound turned off." "Did you ever do that? Turn the sound off? Especially on a commercial? It's like an old silent movie." "I know. I've been doing it for years." "Look," he said, amused. "He's leaving and she's going to stay. And without even so much as a glass in her hand." Greg had expected to be afraid of David Wilder Savage and was surprised that she was not at all. She felt instead as if he and she standing here together laughing and observing the others were something special, the in-group, and everyone outside of the two of them were the out-group. "Where did you get that diction?" he asked her. "In speech class. You want to be an actress." "I am an actress. One might say, not a dental assistant." She laughed. "No, I'm really an actress. I just didn't want to waltz up and tell you because it would have sounded so damned clubby. Like someone coming up to you at a cocktail party and saying, 'We have something in common,' as if that's supposed to make you like him." "Exactly," she said. "Exactly. Are you here with someone?" Tony would understand, she thought. He'd do the same thing himself if he could. "No," she said. "No, I'm not." "Not the dentist?" "No one." "This is a very boring party, don't you think?" She looked up at him. "Not right in this corner." He took her arm. "Let's take the corner with us." "I'll get my coat." She slipped off to the hostess's bedroom to retrieve her coat, looking for Tony out of the corner of her eye, but hoping that she would not be able to find him. She paused for an instant at the mirror, looking at her face. How dark her eyes were, and how much they revealed, even to herself. She had noticed another quality to David Wilder Savage, something just under the surface, a kind of hidden cruelty. It was as if he were basically a ruthless person, but had a tender side that he would show only to the one person he cared about. His charm told her that the person could be her, and her sense told her it was a lie, a trap, one that few girls could be cautious enough to resist putting to a test. She pulled her coat on and lifted her long hair out of the collar. She was a near stranger to him and he to her, but she had seen the challenging combination of cruelty and tenderness. She saw it all in an instant, as a drowning person sees his life pass before his eyes, and then she plunged out of the safe room to where he was waiting for her in the hall. It was odd. Ordinarily, she would have been impressed and delighted by the wave of recognition that went around the room when he took her into the restaurant for dinner. She liked walking into a room with someone who was known. It gave her confidence. And at the back of her mind was always the hope that she would be introduced to or discovered by someone who could help her in her career. But with David, she found herself resenting the table hoppers who took his time, the greeters who demanded his attention. Everything he said to her seemed important, and every time he turned away to speak to someone else, she felt as if she had left the safe in-group for a moment, and she remembered who she was and how alone she would be again in an hour or two. When they had finished dinner, it was after midnight. The diners had left the restaurant, and the drinkers had appeared. "Come up town to my house," he said. Knowing herself, she tried to think of any inane remark to play for time. Why? He looked at her perfectly calmly, as if it were not an inane remark at all, and said, "Because I want to make love to you." "I don't want to," she stammered. "All right," he said. He helped her with her coat, and they went out to the street, where he hailed a taxi. "Where do you live?" She told him, and shrank into her corner of the taxi in a state of growing depression as the street slipped by. He was taking her home, and she didn't want to go home. Like a child, she was afraid of the dark and loneliness, and, like a child, she reached out and tugged at his sleeve. He took her hand. She knew she would never see him again, and she couldn't bear it. He was something strange and exciting that had come into her life, only for one evening. Really, just a few hours. And what was she to him? Someone he'd had fun with, whom he might remember if her name were ever mentioned to him again. "I don't want to go home," she said. "Where do you want to go then?" "I don't care. I just can't stand to give you up." He didn't seem to think it was a frantic or silly thing to say. He simply leaned forward and gave the driver his address, and then moved back and put his arm around Greg, comfortingly, with none of the appurtenances of passion. She felt suddenly as if what she had just said to him was somehow romantic and important. She had never seen an apartment like his before. She had always felt that you could tell more from one look at a person's apartment than you could from an hour of talk with him. There were the people who didn't care about their homes at all, and there were those who cared but had nothing to add to them. David's apartment must have contained over 1,000 books. Books were in the tall bookshelves that lined an entire wall of the living room, and they spilled over to every chair in the room. On the round dining table were at least a dozen play scripts. On the floor beside the table was a large straw basket filled with magazines. He took off her coat, and with the coat still in his hand, walked to the phonograph and turned it on. She noticed his records then, long-playing records, 4 feet of them from end to end. At the far end of the room, between the bookshelves, was an old-fashioned fireplace with a carved black marble mantelpiece. It was a much-used fireplace, with a fire screen and blackened fire tools, and logs waiting to be burned among the coals. He put her coat into his closet and knelt down to light the fire. In front of the fireplace was a long, black sofa. She could imagine him sitting there in the dark, staring into the flames, and it made him seem more satanic-looking than ever. "Would you like brandy?" "Yes, please." He brought a bottle of brandy and 2 glasses to the low coffee table in front of the sofa and sat beside her. The music on the phonograph was a classical piece that she had never heard before, and he had it turned up loud, as if he really enjoyed hearing it, not as if it were background music to a seduction. "Have you really read all those books?" she asked, gesturing. "Yes." "And those magazines? And those scripts?" "Yes, I'm always looking for something." On one of the side tables beside an armchair, there were no books at all. Instead, there was a large, silver-framed photograph of 2 men on a sailboat in summer, smiling and squinting into the sun, wearing white trousers and white sweatshirts, and standing with their arms loosely flung around each other. She stood and wandered over to it. One of the men was David, many years younger, with a softer, vaguer face, and the other was a rather handsome, sensitive-looking young man with the build of a large tennis player. "Who's that?" "Gordon MacKay." "Oh," she said, "the one whose play you just put on." "That's right." His voice seemed to have tightened, as if he were very conscious of the way it sounded in the room. She didn't know what to say. She couldn't say, "I'm sorry about your friend's death," or "I'm sorry about your friend's flop," either. Somehow she felt that if she said anything like that, it would destroy instantly the intimacy she and David were feeling together at this moment. "I'm sorry I never got to see the play," she said finally. "More brandy?" he asked, and filled her glass without waiting for a reply. She remembered something Tony had told her once about David Wilder Savage and Gordon MacKay, some spiteful thing, the sort of thing unsuccessful people often say about successful ones, a kind of name-dropping gone one step further to become insult-dropping. What was it he'd said? Oh, yes, no one knows for sure whether they were in love with each other. But now we'll see if he can ever put on another hit, or if the light has gone out for him. That was the worst thing she had ever heard said about David Wilder Savage. Most of the kids at the class discussed instead his theatrical genius and his reputation as a wolf. Why did people have to say that 2 men were in love with each other when they merely loved each other? Couldn't people realize what a rare and miraculous thing closeness could be without trying to dirty it? She felt suddenly that the world was full of cruel and silly people, like Tony and her family, and a long, long string of girls she had gone to school with, and boys who had pawed her, all of them separate and lonely and spiteful and afraid to love each other. Like a sleepwalker, she went to the sofa where David was sitting motionless. The room was dark, and the redness of the flames shone on the fabric of the couch and made it look black and red both, and on the glass of brandy on the table, making it shine like a garnet. She touched his face. He did not pull her down to the couch, but stood up in one swift gesture, put his arms around her, and took her to the couch with him. She felt a touch of surprise at his first kiss, as she always did with anyone's, because the shape of the mouth never seemed to be related to the feeling of the kiss it gave. With his, she felt astonishment that a cruel mouth could be capable of such warmth and gentleness. "You have the softest mouth in the history of the world," he murmured, "and you too." He was taking off her dress and slip and stockings without ever removing his lips from her mouth and face, as if his hands were an efficient, unobtrusive part of him and his lovemaking. She had an instant flash of her old caution at this, thinking, oh, how practiced. He must have made love to hundreds of women. And then his hands were no longer disembodied, and she was glad for the experience they had, as if it had all been waiting for her. The one fear hit her then, of pregnancy and disgrace, and she hated her own passion-thickened, fearful little girl's voice, which had to ask that damned question that hurtled her out of the clouds. "Do you have something? Don't you?" "I didn't know." "All right." For the moment that he was gone from her, she closed her eyes, shaken with dizziness, and then he returned and took her into his arms. She felt the coolness of his skin and the warmth of the firelight, as if it were all in a dream filled with pleasure that was like pain, and the old, old words of demand and obscenity that seemed like words of love in his mouth. He spoke them to her, and she spoke them back to him, both of them urgently, both of them with their eyes open, searching each other's faces, trembling, until the last moment when passion separated them. He did not draw away when he was finished, or let her go, but kept his arms around her, looking again into her face. The music on the phonograph had long since played out, and the room was silent except for the clicking of the needle against the last groove, forgotten and alone. She held him in her arms as if he were the child this time, and she, a woman, and stroked his hair, wishing they could stay that way forever. Finally, he drew away. "This damned thing," he said, amused and annoyed. "I haven't used one of these things since I was 16 years old." "You're speaking of the 16th of an inch between me and the Home for Unwed Mothers." "Well, next time you contribute." "Well, what did you expect? Do you think I go to every cocktail party prepared for something like this?" "Are we having our first fight?" From the shadows behind them, the telephone rang, softly. She looked at her watch. "My gosh, they call at 2 o'clock in the morning?" He stood up. "Drink your brandy," he said affectionately, ruffling her hair, and went to answer the phone. Left by herself, she smiled into the fire, feeling the hot bitterness of the brandy in her throat and the faint scratchiness of the couch fabric against her bare legs. She could hear David laughing at something the person on the telephone was saying, and his occasional exclamations of amusement. She finished her brandy and stood up languidly, groggy with the aftermath of love and the kind darkness of the heated room, and went to the phonograph. She lifted the needle and turned the record over, tuning it down very softly so it would not disturb David on the telephone. There was an overflowing ashtray on the windowsill, and she picked it up and took it to the kitchen to empty it. She could still hear his voice on the telephone, masculine and laughing and independent, and she remembered the way it had sounded, speaking to her in the words of lovemaking. The sound of his voice then had been for her and her alone. She could not remember ever having felt so content. She wondered whether the window in his kitchen was uncurtained because he did not own a curtain or because it was at the laundry. He probably didn't own one. A bachelor as busy as he wouldn't even know about those things. Wouldn't it surprise him if she made curtains for him? She could pick out some fabric tomorrow. Back in the living room, she watched the fire slowly dying and the brandy level going down in the bottle as David talked on and on to whomever it was on the other end of the telephone. She could tell it was a business call from the conversation, and she was not surprised because people in the theater had a way of staying up until all hours. Her wristwatch said 2:25. It gave her a kind of glow to know that she was here with him, in intimacy, waiting for him in the shadows. "All right, boy," he said. "Goodbye. Thanks for calling. Everything's going to be all right." He replaced the receiver and returned to stand beside where Greg was sitting on the couch. She looked up at him. "I think I love you," she said. He smiled at her tenderly and bent down to kiss her forehead. "I do love you," she said. He took her into his arms again,